Good evening. Thank you for having made it to the right event. I'm Clarissa von Spee, the Cleveland Museums of Art Chair of Asian Art and Curator for Chinese Art. I'm delighted to introduce to you tonight the three speakers of this evening's event in conversation, Cai Guo-Qiang and David Stradling, moderated by Philip Dodd. The incentive to bring Cai Guo-Qiang from New York, David Stradling from Cincinnati, and Philip Dodd from London to Cleveland today is this year's citywide celebration of the 50th anniversary of the 1969 Cuyahoga River fire and the remarkable progress in the recovery of its waterways. With this conversation, we also highlight and celebrate the museum's exhibition, Cai Guo-Qiang, Cuyahoga River Lighting, on view in the museum's Focus Gallery through the 22nd of September. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you the internationally acclaimed Chinese-born artist Cai Guo-Qiang, the creator of the exhibition's monumental gunpowder works and an artist of this exhibition, and an artist who is known worldwide for his explosion events, gunpowder-ignited works, and striking installations. Cai choreographed the fireworks for the Beijing Olympic Games in 2008 and recently exhibited colored gunpowder works at the Prado Museum in Madrid in 2017 and at the Uffizi in Florence in 2018. One of Cai Guo-Qiang's perhaps most ambitious projects so far, Sky Ladder, a blazing ladder reaching to the skies, was ignited in 2015 as a gift to his 100-year-old grandmother, his family, and hometown. A documentary with the same title, Sky Ladder, The Art of Cai Guo-Qiang, will be screened as part of the CMA's exhibition program outdoors on the museum grounds on Friday night, August the 16th. Cai Guo-Qiang has also curated exhibitions himself and currently is one of the 6 artists who have been chosen for the Guggenheim Museum's first ever artist-curated show, artistic license, 6 takes on the Guggenheim collection, which is now on display at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. We are extremely fortunate and thrilled to have Cai Guo-Qiang, his family, and the exhibition's project manager, Zijiao Lu, here with us tonight. And I have to say, Cai took a plane yesterday from Beijing to be here tonight. Please give all of them, Cai Guo-Qiang, his family, and Zijiao Lu, a warm welcome. Our second speaker, Professor David Stradling, is contributor to the exhibition's catalog and the acclaimed author, with his brother Richard Stradling, of the bestseller Where the River Burned, Cohen Stokes and the Struggle to Save Cleveland, published in 2015, a very timely publication. Stradling's book opened my eyes for a new understanding of Cleveland's history and those of fast-growing, industrialized, early 20th century American cities. The book can help us understand that environmental progress can only succeed with the improvement of the social conditions in communities and cities. David Stradling is the Associate Dean of Humanities and the Zane Miller Professor of Urban History at the University of Cincinnati. He got his BA in Political Science from Colgate University in 1988 and his PhD in History from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1996. David is the author of several books, including The Nature of New York, an environmental history of the Empire State, published in 2010, Making Mountains, New York City and the Catskills, published in 2007, and Smokestacks and Progressives, Environmentalists, Engineers, and Air Quality in America, 1881 to 1951. And this book was published in 1999. David has just begun work on a global history of dredging, and we are looking forward to his next publication. Please give Professor David Stradling a warm welcome. It is a particular pleasure for me to welcome Philip Dodd, a much admired friend from London who moderated panel discussions with contemporary artists during my time at the British Museum. Philip Dodd was named in 2016 by China Business News as one of the most important global top thinkers. Philip has been director of London's influential Institute of Contemporary Art, and for the last 15 years, he has worked between China and Europe as chairman of an arts and cultural agency, Made in China, which he founded. Both in Britain and China, he has worked with city governments and corporations to help develop cultural quarters and regenerate parts of cities. He has curated major exhibitions in London, New York, Moscow, Beijing, Guangzhou, and other cities, with artists including the Oscar-winning Steve McQueen, the Chinese artist Zhu Jinshi, Yoko Ono, and the abstract artist Shane Scully. Philip has been visiting professor in many universities, and he has published many books on art and culture. His 1986 study, Englishness, Politics and Culture, 1880 to 1920, was republished recently by Bloomsbury. He's an award-winning presenter on the BBC, has written scripts, produced films, and is currently presenter of BBC Radio 3 Free Thinking. Before I hand over to Philip, I would like to thank all who have helped organizing this event, in particular Deirdre McPherson, Jackie Anselmo, and Kristen Majorkurt. May I remind you also to switch off your mobile phones as this event is recorded. And now I leave the conversation to Philip, who is an artist world-renowned for his explosion events and a specialist and expert in environmental history. And I cannot imagine a better person than Philip Dodd to make this conversation a meaningful discussion for us all. Please give Philip a warm welcome.
I hate positive introductions about myself because they generate expectations in an audience I may not be able to fulfill. It is a great pleasure to be here, and I should be honest to say this is the first time I've been in Cleveland, but I have a feeling it will not be the last time I've been in Cleveland. Let me explain how we want to make this work. I will talk with David for about 20 minutes, and then David will leave the stage and Cai will come on the stage, and then I will speak to him for around 35 minutes, and then I will bring them together in a duet, to speak in operatic terms, for the last 15 minutes, in which I will be very happy for you to be involved. When I present programs on the BBC to all the contributors, and especially when there's an audience, I say Billie Holiday could do wonderful things in 3 minutes. So make your questions very brief and to the point, if you would. And the logic behind this evening, and Clarissa's kinder introduction, it is true that I spend quite a lot of my time in China. When I go back to London, there will be a group of Beijing developers trying to understand how cities are transformed from industrial cities to post-industrial cities. And at that level, Cleveland is a very interesting example of a city that's going through precisely that transformation. So I want to begin, if I may, just by trying to give you a context for what an outsider such as myself thinks is the importance of what happened here in 1969. It was the great Argentinian writer and Nobel Prize winner, Jorge Luis Borges, who said that everything that happens in the present changes everything that has happened in the past. This is as true of the 1969 Cuyahoga burning river as of anything I know. That fire was seen at the time, of course, as of more than national interest. After all, the BBC in London announced at the time that Cleveland was the pollution capital of the world. It's good I can go back and tell them that's no longer the case. But looking back from 2019, the significance of the fire has metamorphosed now that there's global talk of a climate emergency. The river that burned takes us back to an earlier moment of the Industrial Revolution and to what that revolution meant in ecological terms. John Muir, the great American ecological critic, was influenced by the English art critic John Ruskin. And in the late 19th century, Ruskin confided to his diaries that the skies were growing darker in London. The skies were growing darker, he kept saying. I'm sure this is the case. And for a time, it was thought that Ruskin's apocalyptic thoughts were a sign of his madness. But more recent research suggests pollution was so bad in 19th century London that the skies did indeed darken during those times. The Cuyahoga burning is part of that story, a story that unfolds not only the West, but countries across Asia and not least China. China's rapid industrialization, the speed of which is simply unprecedented in global history, has led to many of the same problems that blighted the US and Europe. But I always tell myself that that same industrial revolution has brought 400 million Chinese people out of absolute poverty. So this is a very complex process. But I think the cleansing of the river in Cleveland over the last 40 years also has global significance for our common future. The move from an industrial economy to a service economy, the transformation of old factories into cultural, retail and entertainment spaces, the redemption of natural resources. What's happening here in Cleveland is happening all over the world, and not least in China. The move from made in China to created in China has accelerated, and old factories are being emptied across China and being repurposed for creative and cultural businesses as China tries to grapple with its damaging of the earth and of its citizens. I start with this just to say to a local Cleveland audience that what happened here in this city 40 years ago is of global importance. As that great American writer William Faulkner once said, the past is not dead. The past is not even past. We couldn't have two better guests this evening to discuss ecology, the city, and art. And I'm going to start with David. I was going to introduce David and Cai and say of Cai, as I absolutely believe, that he's one of the most important artists working in the world today. But he doesn't need me to tell him that. So I just invite David to come up, and he and I will play tennis for 20 minutes of a certain intellectual sort. So David Stradling.
Thanks.
David, I want to begin with a simple question that, like all good simple BBC questions, is very complex, which is, was the 1969 river burning the end of something or the beginning of something?
It's both, of course. It is the last time the Cuyahoga caught fire, and so we shouldn't lose track of the fact that that this marks the end of a terrible era for water quality, not just in Cleveland, but in the United States generally. So it's a watershed, and the beginning it was actually well established before the last of the fires, which is that more and more Americans, and since we're talking globally, more and more people living in industrialized nations recognized that more attention had to be paid to the ways in which pollution was affecting the environment, and not just for ecological reasons, but for human health reasons, for simply the quality of life that people wanted to improve in places like Cleveland.
It's 2019. It's however many years it is since '69. There's a danger of thinking it was the end, the worst point, the nadir of something. But was there a period after your book when things seemed to be getting even worse?
You know, it's interesting that my brother and I were focused on a period, the late 60s and early 70s, that if you're looking at the history of cities, we called it in the United States the urban crisis. If you're looking at the environment, you would call that period the environmental crisis. But very, very few people put those things together and told those stories together. And so one of the things that we did notice, I mean, that all of us have noticed, is that the environmental crisis has been alleviated in the United States, largely because of regulation, but also because we have exported so many of the problematic industries to other parts of the world. At the same time, in many ways, the urban crisis never gets solved. That we still have problems of racism and social inequality, a lack of social justice in all of our cities, and even as cities like Cleveland have seen remarkable progress over the last 20 or 30 years, particularly. Much of that progress has simply involved the shifting of where wealth is being located and where poverty is being located. So I would say that probably the urban crisis continues to deepen, and not just in Cleveland, through the 1970s and into the 1980s, and then gets mistaken in a different way for the problems of drugs in urban America. We have a habit of mislabeling what's actually going on.
Is it true that it was defined as an environmental crisis in the late 60s? Or is that a retrospective attribution of a term?
So I do think that people were noticing an environmental crisis. By the time the Cuyahoga catches fire and the Santa Barbara oil spill takes place almost at the same time, and then just 10 months later, we have Earth Day, the first Earth Day. And that was not the beginning of the recognition of the environmental problem. But that so many Americans participated in the first Earth Day was a recognition that it had been noticed. So I think that people were calling it a crisis, but they weren't necessarily locating it in cities, right?
I want to reference that strange country called France, because I was in Paris 3 weeks ago. Every weekend there is a demonstration called by the Gilets jaunes. These are people who wear yellow vests and do not like President Macron. I think that's a kind English way of describing how they feel about President Macron. And I noticed one of them, and I'll translate for you what her poster said, because Macron is a great environmentalist. And she said, and the poster said, "President Macron, you are worried about surviving till the end of the world. I am worried about surviving with my children to the end of the month." And I thought it was an interesting issue, which your book is very good on, that you can't separate out an environmental from an urban and economic inequality.
Which reminds me very much of Carl Stokes, who is the central figure of the story that we tell about Cleveland in the late 1960s.
Who was the mayor? I should,
the mayor.
As the outsider, I shouldn't be saying.
Right.
Yeah.
Carl Stokes, as I'm sure you've been reminded since the 50th anniversary a couple of years ago of his being elected mayor, was a very charismatic and effective politician. I mean, to be an African-American man, to be elected to a majority white city as a mayor is an indication of his powers. But one of the things that I so admired, his collection is at the Western Reserve Historical Society across the street, a remarkable collection of documents that revealed the struggle that he and his very talented team of administrators were dealing with in Cleveland as it was deindustrializing, as the poverty was being ever more concentrated inside of the city limits, and white flight was continuing, in fact, quickening at this period, is that he, as much as he understood that Cleveland needed to solve the problems of water and air pollution, both of which were taxing the citizens of the city, he did not want to be known as an environmentalist. He wouldn't have called himself that. He worked very, very hard to solve environmental problems, but first and foremost in his mind were the environments that surrounded people in their daily lives, and that mostly meant housing. So he was very concerned about solving those things that we would call part of the urban crisis, but recognizing that the two were intertwined.
If that's so, how successful were his inventions? I ask that because at the moment, the Malaysians and the Indonesians and all other groups of Southeast Asians are just telling Britain to send our rubbish back because we've been outsourcing our rubbish to Southeast Asia and expecting them to deal with it. And they're now returning the favor by saying, actually, we don't want your disorder. We have enough of our own. Thank you. And of course, it's true both in the States and in Europe. We outsourced a lot of our manufacturing to China. You know, it was the manufacturing basin of the world, largely because labor was so much cheaper there. We decided, actually, to make things there rather than here. So I'm interested how much you think that those epochal shifts change things, and how much a mayor of a city changed these things.
I'll come back to the question of Carl Stokes' effectiveness, because he was most articulate in describing his disappointment about what he was able to accomplish or not accomplish. But I will say, to get back to your point about the sign with Macron, Stokes understood that very dichotomy, that you have to survive to the end of the month and you have to survive to the end of time. To do one and not the other is a failure. And I'm thinking here of the way that he dealt with water pollution in the Lake Erie. He understood that this was a large, complex problem that needed probably decades to solve, and he wasn't wrong about that. But you have to get started on that work right away. But he also thought that the citizens of Cleveland should be able to swim in Lake Erie. So he got started on a very practical-minded, to our ears may sound like an odd solution, which was to put plastic barriers around two of the beaches in the water, and then douse the water that was behind the plastic with chlorine to create pools in the lake, and then to clean up all of the dead fish who floated up onto the beach, but to allow people to swim for the many years that they would not be swimming at Edgewater Beach or a White City Beach. So in other words, you have to do both at the same time. To get back to whether or not he's effective in the long term, obviously we talk about him with admiration, so there's success in the way that we speak about him. He, as you may know, served for 2 terms as mayor, 4 years total. He left politics for much of the rest of his life because he was so disappointed in the ways in which the forces of conservatism, of white racism, of rural interests, suburban interests worked against his administration in the city of Cleveland. He wrote a really lovely book. I mean, it's depressing to read now because it seems like it could be written right now, called The Promises of Power, which is about the ways in which all of these things constrained the city, him personally as an African-American mayor, but also the city of Cleveland as the center of poverty in African-American populations in metropolitan Cleveland.
I was taken on the river by Clarissa, a rather wonderful journey although not as far as where the river burnt this afternoon. And it struck me, and since you're from Cincinnati, you may not get out of this alive unless you answer it very sensitively. I was taken down the river and I felt I was watching a city whose history I could see repeated in China, which is a city somewhere between industrialized and post-industrialized. You know, there are still the great factories, and some of them are operating, but many of them are not. There isn't, or there doesn't seem to be, the resources investment, whether private or public sector, to renew them and make them into new kinds of service centres. So the big question is, does Stokes in the end turn out to be right? Does he win? Or in a sense, you know, is his history a kind of glorious defeat?
I think one of the things that I admired most about him was his farsightedness. And I do think in that regard, I think he was absolutely right, that for Northeast Ohio to succeed, Cleveland has to succeed. There were other leaders who recognized that too, white and suburban leaders both, who recognized that that was the case. It's just that it took an awful long time for the majority of others to recognize that investment in the core would serve the broader purpose. And so I think that Stokes would, in fact, one of the great pleasures of my career so far was interviewing Louis Stokes, Carl's brother, just a few years before he passed, and to hear, well, the admiration that Louis Stokes had in his voice for his brother and his good work, but also what had happened in Cleveland in recent years. We spoke in the Key Tower, where his law office was at the time. And he was so pleased that people were moving back to the city of Cleveland, that things had turned around. And I think that, you know, that was something that both he and his brother had worked a long time for.
But it's true, because I looked up these figures, as it's true of London, let me say, that people are leaving these big cities, that the population in Cleveland and in London, for instance, London's lost 500,000 over the last 3 years. There is a kind of flight from the cities for a whole complex of reasons which are often different in Cleveland than London. Is that diminution in population, can you do good things with that, or is it a defeat?
Yeah. You know, it's funny, in the United States, we usually have just one measure for the success of cities, and that is population growth. And I think that that's not, now we should recognize that that's rather simple-minded, that as an industrial city in the 1950s, Cleveland needed 1 million people. As a post-industrial city in 2020, it doesn't, to be successful. And in fact, if it had that many people, it probably would not be all that successful as a post-industrial city in the way that it has an opportunity to be now. I mean, we've seen, in just the 15 years that I've been engaged intimately with Cleveland, a remarkable shift in land use, and you see something that's underway. If you were here 10 years ago, the number of parklands that have been created accessible along the river and along the lake. It's really, it has transformed the way that people can live in this place.
I want to ask you maybe the last question before I bring San, which is the industrial era now, partly because we've come to its end. And even in China, it's coming to its end now, is often spoken of very harshly. And yet I remember an old German philosopher called Hegel, who said, the owl of history only flies at dusk. In other words, you only understand things when they're past. And you know, I go to China 6 times a year, and I've been doing this for 20 years. And I understand from the outside the damage that industrialization has done to things in China. But I also know, as I said, that it has brought 400 million people out of absolute poverty, industrialization in China. So I want you to put your best historical hat on. What is the loss and what is the gain of moving from industrial to post-industrial in Cleveland? Because at the moment it's easy to say, forget all that. Well, it was terrible. It destroyed the planet. But it also brought those 400 million people out of poverty.
Yeah, I think in the United States, we most lament those blue-collar jobs, those good union jobs that people could make a good middle-class living, working in the steel mills. And obviously there are still some people who do that, but it's far, far fewer. And we will never get back that broad working class that was simultaneously middle class, that created such wonderful urban neighborhoods, right? The Slavic village in those neighborhoods in Cleveland. I mean, there's something that was lost there, right? That the solidarity of those workers, their attachment to their jobs and their craft. I think that is something to lament. What is to be gained, of course, is that you have to be alert to what can be accomplished in the next phase. And that was one of Cleveland's, and the United States, it wasn't a Cleveland-only issue, is to recognize when it was time to begin investing in other ways, right? To not just clear out factories that no longer worked and hope that somebody would build a new factory, but to envision what that land could be used for in the next era.
And if you were a British politician, which thankfully you're not, so thankfully I'm not interviewing you, are you quietly optimistic, as the British say?
I'm optimistic about Midwestern American cities. I think that we are well positioned in a warming world. I think there are some cities that will fare very poorly during the era of
Do you want to name
climate.
them?
I don't think Miami is very well situated. I don't think Phoenix is very well situated. I think there are a lot of very large cities that are going to have some very difficult times trying to adjust. But this time we will know. It will have a name. I think the last urban crisis, when we just called it that vague urban crisis, people did not, I think we had been an industrial nation for so long and had not seen other nations transition in the way that the United States was about to, that we mislabeled it. When the waters rise in Miami Beach, as they will.
As they are already.
As they are already, we'll know what the problem is. It has a name, and I'm not entirely sure that we know what the solutions are, but at least we know what the problem is.
David, thank you very much for the moment.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cai Guo-Qiang.
Oh, thank you. Hot water.
This terrible Western habit of iced water. I can't remember if Clarissa said so. I just want to, because I think it is important about Cai that, he was born in Shenzhou, which faces Taiwan in 57, but he did move to Japan in 86 and then to the US here in 95. And I think those movements do make him an artist who actually is very different from almost any other artist I can think of. Many Chinese artists in the 80s moved to Paris or moved to the US or even to Berlin. By going to Japan, he made what the chess people would call a knight's move, and I think a really very interesting move, which I think has shaped his practice. He has a lot of images and he wants to talk about them, but I want to begin, if I may, by asking him a couple of questions, partly because it's very rare for me to have this opportunity, so I'm going to be profoundly selfish for a moment. Cai, I've seen your work in Shanghai, in New York, in Florence, in many places, and here, of course, now in Cleveland, I think you have a profound sense of place. And so I'm interested in two things. The first, is that the case? And the second, since Cleveland was for you, like for me, not a place you knew, how did you engender in your sense the sense of this place?
OK， 等一下幻灯片会说到的。
Later, I will talk about it as well on my presentation of many images.
对，但是这个克利夫兰，我在各个地方做作品，他刚才说是怎么切入的，有一点像看风水一样的。
He asked me how, when I come to a new place to make art exhibitions, and how do I start? For me, it's a similar process as to diagnose the feng shui of a place.
就是看那个城市的历史啊、地形啊，它的那个能量的变化。
To see the landscape, the geographic formation, and the change of energy in that particular place.
当然，这个风水不光是这个土地啊，还有这个看得见的、看不见的这一些气啊，它同时还有这个人的生活文化，包括这个克利夫兰出现的这个事情，也是克利夫兰人的这个文化和他们的现代化进程的一个事件，大的事件。所以我的作品也不光这个地点，也包括了经常会包含一些历史事件。
So to diagnose the feng shui of a certain places, it's not just about looking at its land and its visible or invisible flow of qi. It's also about the life and culture of the local people. I come to Cleveland, I see the people here, and I get a sense of the history of its modernization. So sometimes for me, a pivotal event is also an inspiration for my work.
And do you think you could, because your work is shown all over the place. So in English, there are two meanings which you cannot translate into Chinese. I know this. There's rooted and routed. I think he's very rooted, R-O-O-T-E-D. But I think his work is very routed, R-O-U-T-E-D. And I'm just wondering if he could move so wonderfully across the world if he himself wasn't rooted.
他说在英被翻译成中文，一个是 rooted， 一个是 routed。rooted 就是生根的意思，植根。routed 就是就是可以有路线。他说你很难，他觉得你在全世界都在做展览，如果你是一个 routed 的人，那你在到处都有你的轨迹。但是他觉得你如果不是 rooted 的话，就是不是在某个地方有根的话，你也很难做到这么在四处的自由游走。
I could leave now.
So is there a question?
Yes.
我可以解释一下。
Whether he personally has got a profound sense of place.
对，我的艺术有一个基本后边的东西，就是用看得见的表现看不见的世界。
The fundamental principle of my art is to use the invisible, to use the visible means to represent the invisible world.
所以这个看不见的世界，不光是包括天文学的宇宙啊，还有包括这一个风水啊，也包括祖先啊等等。
So the invisible dimension does not only include astrophysics and the feng shui principle, but it also includes my ancestors.
所以在我看起来很多事情看得见的，看不见的比看得见的更重要。
So for me, in a lot of sense, that the invisible dimension is more important than the visible things.
那所以在看不见的世界里面，其实并没有那么多的文化上的差别，看得见的差别更多。
So in the invisible world, there are actually not so many differences between different cultures, which manifest itself more profoundly in the visible world.
可能他也知道，我有时候也做外星人的项目。
Perhaps you know that I have done projects for the extraterrestrials.
所以从宇宙的更大的时空来看，克利夫兰和泉州还有北京的差别就没有那么严重。
So from a more cosmological perspective, and a city like Cleveland, maybe it's not so much different from Quanzhou or Beijing, where I am very familiar with.
就像刚才他和那个 David 也在说的，克利夫兰的很多事情，今天在中国也同样在发生。
Just as what you and David talked about, a lot of the history that Cleveland had went through is repeating itself in China these days.
对，然后如果当中国把自己的产业送到了柬埔寨和越南去的时候，其实中国发生的事情，明天在越南和柬埔寨在发生。
So by the time when China had started to shift to export its manufacturing to Laos or Cambodia, what happening in Laos and Cambodia later will be what happening to China nowadays.
哪天我们人类跑到火星啊去住的时候，又把我们的问题发展到火星上去。
When human beings migrate to Mars, we are bringing our problems to the Mars as well.
We're very inventive. I'm sure we will do it when it's necessary. I want to ask you one thing that arises from what you've just said, the cosmological perspective. Because I've read accounts of Cai that speaking as belonging to the land art tradition. But actually, I'm not sure that he hasn't transformed that tradition by thinking of the sky and the heavens, because in Chinese, the same word for the sky is the word for heaven. That actually the cosmological perspective and the view onto the Cuyahoga River is from above. That Cai's great contribution is, as it were, the sky and the heaven. He writes upon those like some of the great American land artists wrote on the earth. Is that a question?
这评价很好。
I'm doing something wrong here.
对我
Does it make sense to him?
也很正确，是一个是不是站在人的角度来看，而是从宇宙角度看。
What you just commented is it's appropriate because my work, for my work, I'm not looking at this work from a human being's perspective, but from someone who's standing above.
另外一个就是不是试图在大地艺术啊、大地上做一些可以见的，就完了。更多的是通过可以见的能表现那个看不见的。
My art does not end by building something visible on the land, but it's more about creating a sense of something that's invisible.
那所以，但是我还是要说说我今天要说的主题。
But I have to come back to the theme that I have prepared today.
这个主题是我第一次说的。
This is the first time I talk about this subject matter.
因为我做火药，还有做烟火，然后要说环境保护啊，环境，这本来是一个很好笑的事情。
Because I am known for using gunpowder and making fireworks, and as such a person talking about environment is just like a funny thing.
这是一个很危险的事情。
Because it's very dangerous for me to talk about this.
但是可以，大家确实火药和烟火都对环境造成了一点点影响，确实。
Of course, actually, gunpowder and firework does have a certain negative impact on the environment.
主要是硫产生的硫。
Mostly because of the sulfur that is created during the explosion.
那大家可以看看，我是可以自己按的，对吧？可以看看我是怎么在为这个环境做努力。
Using these slides, I want to show you guys how I have been trying to reduce the negative environmental impact of fireworks.
就是因为这个，每个人如果去看一个烟火表演，他要看30分钟啊，1个小时才会很满意才离开。
Whenever someone who go to see a fireworks show, he or she would like to see 30 minutes, an hour of explosion in the sky to be satisfied.
那就要放很多烟火。
Then you have to shoot tons of fireworks into the sky and making bing bong sounds for a long time.
但是我如果把这个烟火做成有主题的、有作品的。
But if I make the fireworks something thematic, like our work itself.
就像我在为 MoMA 做的这个彩虹。
For example, the transient rainbow that I made for MoMA, New York.
大家知道911以后，全美国不敢放烟火，没有一个地方敢放
You guys all
烟火。
know that after 9/11, in America, no one was there to shoot fireworks.
因为就是在国家苦难的时候还要放烟火，
Because
没有人
that
敢
was the
做
time of a national tragedy. No one feel that they could do such a celebratory gesture.
所以我们去找纽约市长说，第二年2002年，
So then I find a way to talk to the New York mayor and wanted to do this project in 2002, which is the next year after 9/11.
说要不要炸一个彩虹，
So I asked him, can I explode a rainbow over the sky?
让大家有一个希望。
So to give people some hope.
那这个彩虹其实才10几秒钟，
This rainbow only took about a dozen seconds.
对。那么它其实纽约两岸这个东河的两岸，几万人、10几万人在看。
On both sides of New York East River, tens of thousands of people gathered to watch the fireworks.
那人们是看这个咚咚咚咚咚咚咚咚咚咚咚咚咚这个烟火，然后再来咚一个，大家就很开心的就回家
People
了。
seeing the firework, dong dong dong, and then there's the last dong.
You don't do it
and
as well as he
people-
does it.
Sorry. So, yeah, and then people are immediately satisfied by the dozens of seconds.
所有的地铁都是满满的人出来，满满的人回去，
In all the subway cars, it's full of people coming out and returning.
所以就几十秒以内人就能很满足，说 OK 了就回家，不要放那么多的烟火，就是
A
要
dozen of
艺术创意。
dozen of seconds, giving people that kind of satisfaction that traditional fireworks take 30 minutes to create. So that's what I strive for. Firework as artwork to give people a sense of wonder and satisfaction in a short period of time.
那为什么能够有创意达到这样呢？主要还是用了一个高科技，要用高科技。
How can I make such a creative, innovative kind of work? And the most important aspect is to use technology.
因为一般的烟火它打到天上是高高低低的，你要让它变成彩虹这么干净，你就要在那个弹里面装了电脑芯片，告诉他你什么时候要走，你到哪里什么时候要炸开。
Traditional fireworks, then when they were shoot into the sky, they will explode when they are at different altitude. But if you wanted them to explode at the designed place, you have to insert a microchip into them so they know when to open. And
对，这是一个科技用在艺术上。
it's using technology in art.
那这个是奥运会，我有29个大脚印这样走过来。
For the 2008 Beijing Olympic opening ceremony, I created 29 big footprints.
那这个也是有一种科技，
Also, there's another kind of technology
就是
involved.
汽车上放了很多炮筒，这些炮筒就像大炮，会精准打得很准的。
We installed firing tubes on the truck. So this firing tube is pointed at an exact position to shoot the rockets into the sky at precise location.
所以人们看到这一个造型，人们就会已经得到了一个在天空看到了烟火的一些很大的满足。
When people see the image in the sky, they immediately feel satisfied by seeing a complete image in
还
the
有一
sky.
个就是烟火本身一定会产生很多的烟。
Firework is, by definition, it exudes tons of smoke.
中国人把烟火叫烟火或者烟花，两个都离不开烟。
In Chinese, the literal translation of firework is 烟花. Yan means smoke, smoke flower, or smoke fire. These two, so smoke is always involved.
所以像我在那个墨西哥正在做的一个项目，他们的传统技术很好，但是这个火药就是烟很多。
This is one of my projects that's currently going on in Mexico. In Mexico, people have a very long tradition of making firework, and they're very, very skilled. But one of the biggest problem is that their firework has a lot of smoke.
所以我也邀请他们到中国来， 跟中国交流，既可以教给中国一些优秀的墨西哥的工艺，同时也可以向中国学习怎么提高那个微烟更好环境更好的一些制作方法。
So I created an exchange program between the Mexican and the Chinese firework technicians. So the Mexican technician can come to China to teach to share their crafts with the Chinese side and learn from the Chinese technician how to reduce the amount of smoke.
这是在最近刚在中国的浏阳做的事情。
This is the experiment recently happened in Liuyang, China.
大家要知道，全世界的进出口烟花，中国占了将近90%。
You have to know that 90% of the importing firework come from Liuyang.
Come from China.
Come from China.
但70%是从浏阳。
And
中国的
70% of that firework in China come from Liuyang.
所以，如果我们在利用一些国家的项目像奥运会等等，要求国家让这些烟火公司在材料和燃放技术上更环保，那么它未来整个对世界的贡献就会大起来。虽然是一个艺术家在做的事，可是可以影响一个产业的环境，那个产业的那个环保。
So I have taken the advantage of being involved in national events to urge the government to use regulations and technology to improve the firework, to improve the situation with the smoke. So I think this is the work of an artist can also change an entire industry around the world.
这是我以前在中国80年代画的环保的作品。
This is the work that I made in the 1980s in China that is centered on the environmental theme.
有一个充满水的地球，还有一个烧掉的地球。
One is a water-filled earth, the other is a burned earth.
这是那个Fukushima那个津波以后我做的项目。
This is the project that I did after the Fukushima disaster in 2011.
然后因为那个放射线是那个我的一个朋友，我们那些朋友的伊瓦基那个家乡呢，变成了大家都逃难的地方。
Because of the radiations, Iwaki, which I have stayed in the past and have many friends there, become this a refuge, a shelter for people running away from the nuclear disaster.
所以我们一起帮助他们，一起种了1万颗烟花。我们目标是种1万颗烟花，但现在还只是种了5000颗。
So in
10万颗烟花，我们做了5000颗。
So in Iwaki, I wanted to plant 100,000 cherry blossom trees together with the local residents. That's the goal, 100,000 trees. But now we only have planted 5,000.
我们目标是让从空中看下来被放射线污染的土地，就是以后是一个烟花的颜色。
My goal is to create a land of the cherry blossom colored that is over the land that's once contaminated by the nuclear radiation.
然后我们做了美术馆，让小孩可以在那边做展览，让他们更爱自己的故乡。
We made an exhibition there for children to stage their own artworks, to create a sense of love for their hometown.
现在可以看到很多烟花都出来了。
Now you can already see there are many cherry blossom
因为很多
trees.
木头你卖不掉了，很多山林种的田野，人家都不敢买，所以你把它种烟花了。因为放射线的原因，他们以前可以卖木头，可以种田野、水果啊、稻田啊，人家都不买。
Because of the radiation contamination, this land used to grow trees that can be sold for its wood. But now, because people are afraid of the contamination, no one grows those commercial trees anymore, and or any kind of trees that bear fruits. So it became a place for the cherry blossom trees.
这些我就快过。
And I'll go through this very
因为
fast.
好像我说的比较长。
It seems like I have been speaking too long.
那这个是我也做的一个在澳洲的，叫遗产。
This is an installation titled Heritage that I created in Brisbane.
就是好像地球只剩下了一点水，那所有的这些动物都再也不争斗了，很谦卑的低着头在喝这个水。
In this work, I create a sense of the last pound that is left on Earth. All these animals facing this last pound, they stopped fighting against each other and all lower their head and drinking the water in a very humbling manner.
这个作品非常受欢迎，那个观众进来有很多人都很安静，有的人会流眼泪。
This work is loved by many people. When the visitor came in, many of them became quiet, and some of them even shed a few tears.
还有棵树，
I also created a tree.
那孩子在底下想象这个死掉的树要怎么办？
For the same exhibition in Brisbane, under the tree, the kids are all sitting to imagining what to do with this tree that's already dead.
他们给我 idea， 我再从里面挑一个 idea 去实现。
These kids gave me many ideas, and then I would select one to realize as one of my
但
projects.
大量的 idea 都是希望把这棵树还给原住民。
Most of the ideas actually suggest to return this tree back to the Aboriginal people.
这在上海，
This is in Shanghai.
对，这个是以黄浦江的那一个很多死猪飘过去的这件事，对于中国来说有点像我们克里夫兰的那一个河
This
上
is
大火。
incident that happened in the Huangpu River, where there are thousands of dead pigs floating on the river, which is somehow reminds me of what happened to the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland.
所以我做了一个像罗亚方舟一样的，很多动物都奄奄一息的，
So
这样飘过这个黄浦江。
So I created a work that's paying tribute to Noah's Ark. Many animals were on board and looking are almost taking their last breath.
大家可以看到我在任何地方做作品，都跟很多孩子一起。
You can see wherever I go creating work, I always want to get the kids involved.
对，这个是我在展厅里面把那个地板挖了，然后灌满了9吨的墨汁。
This is inside of the museum power station of art in Shanghai. I dug a shape of a waterway and to fill it with ink.
然后有一个黑色的瀑布，
And there is also a black fall.
周边的山水其实看起来像山水画，其实这些都是挖起来的工业废渣。
The surrounding debris, which may look like a landscape, but are actually industrial, a kind of waste that is dug from the floor.
这个刚好这个 PSA 这个美术馆有一个巨大的100多米高的烟囱。
In the power station of arts, which was the industrial space in the past, that it happened to have a chimney that is hundreds of meters high.
那个里面是很安静，但空气不好，所以我里面做了一个秋千，这个几个小孩，当然这个是做的人偶，就叫做天堂的空气，他们好像静静地在里面游戏着。
The space is very quiet, but the air quality inside is not so good. So I created this work of a few replica babies sitting on the swing. I try to create a sense of tranquility that it's as if it is in heaven. The title of this work is called Air in Heaven.
这个是我想象，100年人类如果离开上海。 100-200年以后，上海有很多动物都回来了。上海的这些建筑上面长满了树。
In this work, I imagine the world 100 or 200 years after the humanity has distinguished, many animals came back to reoccupy this place.
I want to, because the range of your work is extraordinary. And the length of time you've been working in this area is extraordinary. I want to know, do you know where this fascination came from? I have a Chinese friend who was an environmental activist who went to the northeast of China in a village. And in the village, when you were born, they plant a tree. When you die, they chop down the tree and bury you and plant another tree. It's a very profoundly ecological. And there are resources in Chinese culture that I think are very important to any ecological project. Do you know where your fascination came from?
人与自然的关系找到平衡，这一个是从风水啊，还有中国的古老的中医啊，这些都有影响了我艺术的方法论。但是我做作品并不是很考虑生态主题的。
To reach a balance between human and nature, to create a good feng shui or Chinese medicine, this kind of things are all very important for my artistic practice. I'm
Were they
not
important
particularly.
when you were growing up?
你在长大的时候
对，是，对，所以这个成了我的艺术的一些基本的方法论。
I wasn't particularly interested in ecological thing, but the previous the things that I talk about, I was already very interested in them when I was growing up, and now it became the basis of my artistic practice.
但我主动去用生态的主题做作品，我不是很多，偶尔有一点也是这个时代的反应而已。
To use the ecology as a theme of my work is actually rare for me. I don't actively thinking about how to comment on the environmental issues, but whenever I did it, it's a very natural reaction towards what had happened in our society and what had happened to our environment.
然后我再给他放完它，很快的，快。
So yeah, let me just finish it. Be fast.
所以我在那个河上做了一个作品，叫做挽歌。
For the same exhibition, during the opening day, I created a daytime explosion firework called an elegy.
本来我是要把它叫做葬礼，但是上海市的这些官员呢，他们很不愿意我叫葬礼，但是又不愿意叫我不可以叫葬礼，他们就通过警察来告诉我说，我们同意你做这个作品，你总不能让我们回去给我们的家人说这个艺术家在做一个葬礼啊，所以你想想能不能有一些比较好听的？我说那就叫挽歌吧。
So the original title I came up for this explosion event is actually called Funeral, and the police in Shanghai who the government official who had helped me to obtain the permit to do the explosion event heard about this title and told me, well, we gave you the permit, but it's very difficult for us to tell our family that we help an artist to create an artwork which is titled Funeral. Can you maybe use a euphemism to make it sound better? So I came up with the title elegy.
所以我就在这条河上做了一个对自然的环境的一个葬礼。
So I create this work that's actually a funeral for our declined environment.
当然，这一些烟火就要考虑到它是能够在科技这个环保上能够解决的，也是因为它在环保能过关，所以后来我在佛罗伦萨，就像他说的，在佛罗伦萨乌维奇展览，我做了一场白天的烟火，才能够出口，因为要审查你这些材料的环保。
So when I was making this work, it was already confirmed that all the material that I used is environmentally friendly. That's how I got the permit, and that's how I was able to do a similar daytime explosion event outside of China, in Florence, as you mentioned.
这个是我给大家讲我最新在做的。
This is what I've been working on most up to date, my most up to date project.
这是一半是保密的。
Part of this is actually confidential.
大家可以看这边这一个烟火呢，底下你们看烟很多，因为这是正常的，而且是质量比较高的，把那个弹打到空中产生的烟。
So on this side, you can see the firework. You can see a shoots of smoke that is on the lower level, which came out when the firing tube shoots the shell into the sky. This is actually already pretty high quality firework at that time, but still the smoke is very visible.
任何这个弹，它要打到几百米高空，它都要用火药把它打上去。这个火药就会产生很多烟。
Whatever you need to shoot a shell into the sky, you need to use gunpowder to create a force to actually push it up. This force using gunpowder creates smoke.
然后这边呢是上面是我们研究微烟的。
The picture on the right hand up corner is the one that I have been experimenting, and you can see the smoke has been reduced.
很少，对吧？
Yeah.
但这个就很多。
And those are a lot of smoke.
那这个就更了不起了。
And this is even more remarkable.
完全无烟。
It's absolutely smoke free.
这个一般的科学家和烟火公司的人坐在这里，都会说这不可能。
If it's a scientist or the firework technicians are in the audience, they will probably say, this is impossible.
对，因为什么呢？你就是不用火药给它打上去，你也要用能量吧？你用了能量，它就有温度吧？有温度，离开这个炮筒，我们的空气会跟这个温度激烈对抗，会有水蒸气产生。因为我们的这个温度比那个超过了这个空气的温度，它会产生水蒸气，连水蒸气都没有，你这是什么办法？对。
They would probably say that, okay, even if you didn't use any gunpowder there, you have to use a certain kind of energy to actually create this force. Whenever there's energy, there's going to create a higher temperature, and the higher temperature is going to create a certain the vaporization process is going to create. When the energy is crashing with the air, there would be some little residue of water, and then that would actually manifest itself as like air that would create something visible. So
Chao is a very good scientist.
Whatever you are doing here is impossible.
但是这一个大家听了很好啊，赶快推广啊！那全世界都用这一个，就不会底下都是烟了嘛？大家会这样想，其实不是。
You may think this is a great solution. We should just introduce this to the world and let everybody use this new technology. But in reality, it's not that simple.
对，因为什么呢？从公安和警察和安全部门来看，传统的火药，从我们将近1000年来，我们开枪啊、打炮啊，我们有很多经验证明它是可靠的，是可控制的。但你现在新做的这些，还没有经过漫长的历史被检验，所以不能随便用。如果要用，还要专门为你这个材料做一个法律。
Whatever is at the authoritative position, the police or the government official, they incline to use traditional firework because it has been tested have been tested for so long in history, and it has become something controllable and reliable. But this new technology has not yet been tested yet, in a sense that's more not reliable. So they would need many, many years of experimentation to prove that this is actually something that can be used in a wider range.
所以这就是我在努力的
So
新
this
的问
is
题
what I'm，
不是解决这个烟和无烟，而是解决这些脑袋里面的无烟。
It's not, so my biggest and the most recent problem is not just to solve the question of smoke or non-smoke, but it's actually to change what people have in their head.
这个我就不看了，我们就不看，大家已经很熟悉了。
Are you going to go through? Yeah.
I want before he got to the end,
Yeah.
I want before bringing David back on just to ask you one question, and this is somebody who looks at your work. So I'm delighted you don't want to be called an ecological artist.
他说他很就是其实高兴，你不希望被就是成为一个生态。
Oh no no no.
But there's something that's very profound and very moving always about Cai's work. And it comes in a title, Transient, Elegy. The work that you see in the museum, something has already happened. It's as if we are already living in a position where the end has arrived. And it's as if you have a profound sense, and I suppose this is my question, a profound sense of tentativeness, of provisionality, of transience.
不是问题。评价好 ，Thank you.
That was a clever answer. Could David, we're going to just move to the last part, partly because I need to eat, otherwise I'm going to faint. More seriously, because you were expecting it and there's a couple leaving because we are slightly late, for which I'm sure I'm responsible. If you could remember the mantra of Billie Holiday, of eloquent but brevity, and just put your hands up and wait for a microphone to come. There's a question here in the middle.
Thank you. This has been so interesting, and I'm really enjoying. I do have a question. You talked about sulfur. Is that in the smoke? And also the residue that comes down from the fireworks. What does that do to our environment?
他说那些你说的那些油是从这个烟里跑出来的，还有它是从炸坏那些油或者它的一种遗留，它们会对我们环境造成什么这样的东西都会在。
这个硫呢，它是会产生一点点这个就是对环境影响的东西，但它并不是那个会吸进去的那一种叫什么？美国那个北京整天说的那个 PM2.5不是那样，它比较粗。那个空中的那一个东西呢，我们都全部改造成为用纸做的，包括那个壳啊，包括里面的一些火药用稻谷啊什么，所以它是可以被环境吸收的。
So the sulfur that came out together with the smoke is indeed will have a certain impact on the environment, but because of it's actually quite because the residue of the sulfur is actually quite large and it cannot be inhaled by human, and it's not those PM 2.5 this kind of thing that we talk about all day. That's discussed all day in Beijing. Also, the material that made the shell that it's being shoot into the sky are made of paper, and the large granular-sized gunpowder is made of barley and other natural material as well, so it can be digested by nature.
但是还是会对环境有不好的影响，这就是一个矛盾。当我们大家整个我们的人类的文化，就是放烟火是我们 不想结束的一个我们的节日的一个盛典，那么我们就会面对它是有影响环境的，所以每一次在大型的活动的时候都要很小心这个责任，怎么给它控制到最大的无毒微烟对环境。对，所以是这样，中国很多城市都禁止人民随便放烟火了，在北京什么都是这样，变成只有国家活动放。所以你又要维持这个文化的传统，又要面对这个环境问题，这是人类的现在的一种状态。
Indeed, the firework does have this negative impact on the environment, but it's somehow a human instinct that we love fireworks and we do not want it to end. It's such a beautiful tradition for all kinds of ceremonial events, but because of this impact on the environment, we really have to take our own responsibility to try to reduce the negative impact to the minimum amount. As nowadays in China, many cities, fireworks and firecrackers are banned in many cities, such as in Beijing, by private citizens. You can do that, but it's only reserved for important national events. So we are facing these conflicts. How can we maintain our tradition, but also facing our responsibility towards our environment?
Question is over there in the middle. Sorry, I can't hear. If you could put it slightly closer to your...
Is your gunpowder art influenced by Asian ink painting?
对，我开始不是想到跟它有关系，后来我弄懂了，因为这个水墨是用木炭做的墨和水画出来的，这个火药画是用木炭做的火药加火烧出来的，它的某种意义上很多那个感受是很像的，那种有些精神还是共通的，对，水墨画和火墨画。
Yes, when I started using gunpowder to create painting, I didn't necessarily think about the connection between gunpowder painting and traditional ink painting. Then I realized that there's a certain connection because the ink is made of charcoal plus water, and gunpowder is made of charcoal and it's manifests itself by the process of burning. So they share a certain sensibility, a certain kind of spirit that is the spirits of the water ink painting and my fire ink painting is certainly connected.
Question here.
A list. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Do you have a list, mental or written, of projects you'd like to try? And if so, perhaps you describe one of them to us.
有没有一个清单你想要试的这种项目？
他是说我未来，还是说我曾经没实现的？
Do you mean the project he planned for the future, or the project he planned in the past but didn't realize? 未来。
OK， 有，我马上去那个 Example 邦斯去研究塞尚的眼睛怎么看到那个土地有宇宙感。下个星期。
And yes, indeed, I am going to Aix-en-Provence next week to study the land that have been depicted and perceived by Cézanne. Paul Cézanne, yeah.
他的眼睛看到的田野怎么有宇宙感？
How does the field that is perceived by his eyes translate into his painting that embody a sense of universe and cosmology?
应该问问 David， 我已经接受了好几个问题了，我比较辛苦。
I'm going to ask David a question if you don't. Sorry, there's a question at the front. He's grown up, so he's fine.
In addition to the element of cosmology, I thought you said that ancestor had entered into your paintings, into your works. Can you tell us how that is manifest?
除了宇宙观之外，你说你的祖先
对，因为他可能知道，像我们坐飞机之前啊，或者什么，还经常离开家，还要给自己的去世的爷爷啊什么磕头再离开。现在我磕头的人就越来越多了，还要给我奶奶磕头，还要给我父亲磕头，就是我去世的亲人越来越多了。那就是这个亲人一直跟随在自己的身边。
As you may know, in my tradition, that we have, whenever we leave home to go to other places, I would bow and knocked my head onto the floor to pay tribute to my family members who has passed away. At first, I started doing this for my grandpa, and later, more and more of my dear family member passed away. Now the list includes my grandma and my father as well. It seems like there are more and more of my ancestor has left me, but in reality, I think they actually follow me around everywhere.
就像我做那个梯子500米高送给我奶奶，100岁，但是1个月以后她就去世了。
For example, I created a sky ladder, which 5 meters high, 500 meters high, and a month for my grandmother. 1 month after that, for my 100-year-old grandmother, a month after that, she passed away.
她没去世之前，我走遍天涯海角，都把她当成在故乡。但是她死了，我就感到她跟着我四处来了。
Before she passed away, wherever I go, I feel my grandma is very far away from me in my hometown. But after she actually left me, I feel she is she is with me always.
Yeah. That's a question.
One thing that was mentioned during the conversation was the impact of sort of anti-environmentalism within certain classes of society where environmental policies impact the hardest. For example, of people out there in France who are protesting Macron's policies. How do you see that intersecting with high art? There is a difference between...
Sorry, I missed that. How does it intersect with...
With like high art, like what we're seeing here is things that are in exhibits. There are things that people pay money to go see, and then there's people who are on the streets protesting in the yellow vests. Is that considered art? Is that considered like anti-environmental art? How does those two concepts kind of interrelate?
You can answer that, and then Cai can answer that.
I'm not entirely sure I can answer that.
That's why I asked you.
I'm not of a mind to think of all not directly environmentalist activities as anti-environmentalist activities. And being human has so many different complexities to it. None of us are all one thing. None of us are working toward one goal. We shouldn't be, or at least over the lifetime we don't. I guess what you're asking is higher art essential? Is all of the effort that Cai is describing? Is it anti-environmental anyway? And I would say no, because I don't believe that humans have to give up being human to be protective of the earth.
Do you want to say something, Cai?
我可能他问题我不是很清楚，但我可以说一个好玩的给大家知道我的看法。
Maybe I'm not so sure about the answer to this particular question, but maybe I can share a funny anecdotal event with you guys here.
因为大家知道做奥运会开幕式或者是国庆啊， 一个重要的时候，北京的天空不错，永远都会不错。
So whenever you have to create an important celebratory firework for a national event such as Olympics or the national celebration of the National Day, the sky of Beijing always look clear.
因为是可以在北京周边的那一些县啊、省啊，很多会排雾气的那种工厂，全部给它关了，让那些人民、那些工人都放假，天气就好了，只要几天就好了。
Around the time of important events, all the factories around the Beijing city, which those factories where exhumed smoke, are all closed for the days, and all the work for a few days. Once the factory is closed, the smoke will not come to the sky of Beijing, and all the workers are having a little break. They can go home and have some of their own time.
所以某种意义上给人也是有一种信心和希望，小小的希望，就是说只要管理得好，只要正确处理好这个产业和这个环境污染的这个平衡，环境会慢慢恢复起来的。就像我们今天一起去看那条河，也还感到还不错，很多鸟在那边，很多鸭子在那边。
So this actually gives people a tiny hope. Maybe if we be mindful about the balance between the firework industry and the environment, we can achieve something. We can achieve something together. For example, as we go to the Cai River today, and we see the transformation of the river, and we feel it's actually quite nice here right now, and we see many birds and ducks, and that also, I think that would give us a sense of hope.
所以问一下 David， 是不是人类如果管控好这个环保问题，还是很容易把这个生态又给它带回来的？
So I have a question for David. Actually, if human beings pay extra attention to the environmental issues, is it possible to bring back a cleaner environment that seems only exist in the past?
Yes, absolutely. I think the lesson of the Cuyahoga fire altogether has to do with the activism, the effort of people like Cohen Stokes and so many other people. That the river did not get cleaner by itself. That there was a lot of work that was done by a lot of people at different levels.
But I take it Cai's asking something tougher, and I hope I'm not wrong, which is, can you return to an earlier moment?
Oh.
In other words, my Methodist teachers told me that repentance was unlike innocence.
Yeah. I don't think that we want to return to an earlier moment. I mean, I think that's sometimes it can be useful to environmental moments to invoke a cleaner or purer past, but I don't think we really want to be there. We want some aspect of the past, and I think that those can be reclaimed, so the pieces of the past that we want, but I don't think there's any reason to give up on the future just because we see things in the present we don't like. So I think maybe I'm just an optimist in that way, that everything about the past is cyclical, and we've been talking about the cycles and the way that things have moved through different nations, and I completely believe that the next we are on an upswing here in Cleveland and in Ohio and in the Midwest, and I think that it is an upswing that includes a much better environment.
我感到我又要说一些环境问题了。我感到就是说，这个环境问题不能光强调环境的绿化这些，还要强调心灵的绿化。
So I think that in environmental issues, we often talk about the cleaning of the physical landscape. But for me, what is more important is to.
No, 不是说也要，不是更重要。
It's equally important. It's not more important, but equally important to purify, to clean our mindset, our heart.
因为我们人类越来越要物质，越来越要更多、更新、更大，使我们这个精神越来越缩小。我们的欲望越来越大，这些都造成了我们这个环境难以承担的原因。假如我们从心灵上能够要求更少，它就会越来越好。
Their increasing desire for material wealth, for everything bigger, had bring the consequence of a diminishing spirit, because such a diminishing spirit of the humanity has created this unbearable burden for our environment. If we can reduce our desire for material wealth, and I think the environment can get better through the change of our mentality as well.
包括生活方式，好像正能量。
Positive energy here.
包括生活方式也是跟自然的呼吸生态更依存在那边，享受那样的幸福感和满足感，而不是一直依赖着更新的技术、更新的交通信息手段。这样我们人类也会跟自然活得更一体，那么环境也会保护得更好。因为我们需要依赖自然，我们就会保护好自然。
If we can have a lifestyle that simply enjoying breathing and simply enjoying being with nature, and not so much rely our happiness on the advancement of the technology, on all kinds of new stuff, but focusing on becoming a unity with nature and simply rely on nature, maybe we can create a better environment this way.
And I can't think of any better place to end this conversation has moved from Cleveland to China, from the cleaning of water to the cleaning of ourselves. Could I thank enormously both David Stradling and Cai Guo-Qiang, and not to forget Sir Chow, who's done a heroic job in translation.
Thank you. 他最后总结的话，还是现在这一点路从特里弗兰到中国，从清洁河水到清洁心灵。
I fully agree with Philip Dodd, who, that both speakers ended on a very positive and hopeful note. And I want to thank all the speakers of the evening: Cai Guo-Qiang, Lu Siqiao for her wonderful translation, Philip Dodd and David Stradling for having come to Cleveland and for a fascinating conversation and insightful information. Thank you all for coming and for your questions. And we hope to see you again on the 16th of August for Skyladder, the open air screening. Thank you again, and good night. Take care. And